The security guard's hand was already on her arm when the first helicopter dropped below the cloud line. Ava Mitchell didn't fight it. She let them walk her through the lobby of North Ridge Medical Center with her badge gone and her scrubs still carrying someone else's blood, while every nurse, every orderly, every doctor on the morning shift turned to watch. Director Calloway stood by the reception desk with his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who had already won. "Your career is over," he said. "Get out." Nobody moved to stop it. Nobody said a word. And then the windows shook. Outside, 3 military helicopters came in low over Silver Creek, their rotors hammering the air so hard the glass trembled in its frames. By the time the first Black Hawk touched down in the parking lot, a convoy of unmarked vehicles was already sealing off the entrance. Armed soldiers moved in tight formation toward the hospital doors. They were looking for someone. And the woman being dragged toward the exit was the only person in that building who already knew why. If this story hits different, follow along, hit like, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning had started badly before it became something worse. Ava had taken the 6 a.m. shift because Donnelly called out sick again, and nobody else would cover the cardiac step-down unit on a Tuesday, and she needed the overtime because her landlord had stopped accepting partial payments. She'd driven to North Ridge with a travel mug of bad coffee and a headache that had been building since Sunday, and she'd walked into handoff to find that the previous night's charge nurse had left 2 patients without updated medication reconciliation and 1 call light that had been going off for 40 minutes. She fixed the call light first, then she pulled the charts. That was Ava's way. Quiet, methodical, start with what's broken, and work forward. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a scene. She just moved through the unit at the beginning of every shift like someone running a pre-mission check, and most of the staff had stopped noticing it because she'd been doing it for 2 years. Charge nurse Linda Harlow noticed. She just noticed it differently. "Mitchell." Harlow appeared at the nursing station with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. She was 50-ish, compact, with the kind of institutional authority that came from 20 years of outlasting everyone around her. "You're not on the schedule for this unit today. You're covering 4 West. Donnelly's out. Supervisor reassigned me last night. I wasn't notified. I can forward you the text." Harlow's jaw tightened. "That's not how reassignments work. You go through me." Ava looked at her for a moment. The kind of look that didn't push back and didn't fold. It just held. "The text came from Supervisor Brandt. I can have her call you if there's a discrepancy." "There's no discrepancy. There's a protocol." Harlow set the clipboard down on the counter with a flat crack. "You document under my supervision on this unit, or you don't document at all. Are we clear?" Ava said yes, because saying anything else would take 10 minutes she didn't have. She went back to the charts. The headache stayed. By 9 o'clock, she had 3 patients stable, 1 who needed a potassium recheck, and a post-surgical man in bed 6 named Mr. Okafor, who kept insisting he didn't need his compression stockings, and kept being wrong about that. She was mid-argument with him, gently, the way you argue with someone who's frustrated and scared and expressing it as stubbornness, when she heard the monitor in bed 4 change pitch. She excused herself from Mr. Okafor before he finished his sentence. Bed 4 was a 63-year-old woman named Dolores Fitch, admitted 2 days prior for a cardiac workup after an outpatient stress test flagged something her cardiologist didn't like. She was on telemetry, mildly anxious, the kind of patient who asked a lot of questions and then apologized for asking. Ava had liked her from the first shift. The monitor was showing runs of PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, clustering in a pattern that made something in Ava's chest go still. She pulled the printout, looked at the rhythm, looked again. "Mrs. Fitch, I need you to stay as still as you can for me. How are you feeling right now?" "A little tight. In here." The woman pressed her fingers below her sternum. "Probably just the eggs I had." "Probably, but I'm going to call your doctor." She stepped to the doorway and flagged an aide. "Get Dr. Voss on the phone. Tell him it's about Fitch in bed 4. Tell him I need him now, not in 15. The aide went. Ava went back to Mrs. Fitch and kept her talking, kept her calm, watched the monitor. The PVCs were coming more frequently. The clustering pattern, short, long, short, was the kind of thing that didn't always mean something catastrophic. But when it did, it moved fast. Dr. Randall Voss arrived in 11 minutes. which in Ava's experience was reasonably fast for an attending whose office was 3 floors down. He was tall, mid-40s, wore his white coat like a costume, and spoke to nursing staff at a register slightly above where he spoke to patients. He looked at the printout, he looked at the monitor, he looked at Ava. "And you called me up here for this?" "The clustering pattern on the E. I can read a strip, Mitchell." He said her name like it was a minor inconvenience. "These are benign ectopics. She's anxious and she's had too much caffeine. I'll adjust her telemetry threshold and we'll check a mag level. The short-long-short sequence is running every 3 or 4 minutes. I'd want a 12 lead before we—" "I didn't ask what you'd want." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The 2 aides at the nursing station were very busy looking at their monitors. "Order the mag level. That's it." Ava stood there for 1 second. Just one. Then, "Yes, doctor." He left. She ordered the mag level. She also flagged the chart with a nursing note documenting the rhythm pattern and her clinical concern, because that was what you did when you were overruled and you were pretty sure you were right, and being right later was the only protection you had. The mag level came back borderline low. She called Voss. He ordered replacement and told her to stop hovering. She was not hovering. She was watching. At 10:40, Mrs. Fitch's rhythm broke. Not catastrophically. Not a V-fib, not a full arrest. A sustained run of ventricular tachycardia that lasted 19 seconds before converting on its own, long enough for every monitor alarm on the unit to go off simultaneously, long enough for Mrs. Fitch to grab the side rail and say, "Oh, oh," in a small, frightened voice, long enough for Ava to be at the bedside before the last alarm was still sounding. "I've got you. You're still with me. Look at me." "My chest." "I know. It's going to feel better in a second. Keep breathing." The rhythm converted. Mrs. Fitch was pale and shaking. Ava was already on the phone. Voss came back up in 4 minutes. He looked at the strip from the event. He looked at the patient. He did not look at Ava. "We'll transfer her to the ICU for closer monitoring. I'd recommend a cardiology consult and an urgent echo before—" "I said ICU." He turned to the aide. "Get the transfer team." He walked out of the room, and Ava heard him in the hallway, clearly because he didn't lower his voice, saying to Harlow, "Get Mitchell off this patient. She's been catastrophizing all morning, and it's making the patient anxious." Harlow said something Ava couldn't hear. Voss said, "Just handle it." She found out she was being written up at 11:15 when Harlow handed her a pink incident report form and told her to complete it before she left for the day. "For what?" Ava asked, though she already knew it wouldn't be for anything real. "Patient agitation, deviation from physician orders, nursing conduct unbecoming." "I followed physician orders, I documented everything, and I'd like to see where you can address it with HR." Harlow's voice was flat, practiced, the voice of someone who'd handed out forms like this before and would again. "You're being reassigned to 4 West for the remainder of the shift. Leave this chart to the transfer team." Ava completed the form. She transferred to 4 West. She kept working because that was the job, and because stopping would mean losing the shift differential she needed for rent, and because there was a particular discipline in continuing when everything in your environment was designed to make you stop. She had learned that discipline somewhere else. She didn't think about it. At 2 in the afternoon, she was called to the director's office. Northridge Medical Center's administrative suite was on the 4th floor, separated from the clinical units by a corridor that always smelled faintly of new carpet and printer toner. The director's office had a view of the Silver Creek downtown, a small skyline that looked more impressive than it was. Director Paul Calloway had been in the role for 3 years, arrived from a regional hospital group with a restructuring mandate and a reputation for cutting costs in ways that eventually became other people's problems. He was behind his desk when Ava came in. Dr. Voss was sitting in one of the chairs to the left. HR manager Sandra Price sat at a small table with a folder open in front of her. Ava had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the outcome was already decided and the meeting was theater. She sat down. She kept her hands still. "Nurse Mitchell," Calloway said, "we've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct this morning. Specifically, regarding your interference with physician directives, your failure to de-escalate a patient anxiety situation, and—" he glanced at the folder. An ongoing pattern of insubordination. I'd like to see the documentation for the pattern. That's not how this works. I have the right to review any written complaints against me. That's in the employee handbook. Price shifted in her seat. Calloway's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Dr. Voss has submitted a formal grievance, he said. Combined with prior notations in your file, we've made a determination regarding your continued employment. The prior notations were 3. One from Harlow about a medication timing dispute that Ava had since gotten corrected. One from 6 months ago when she'd pushed back in a care conference about a discharge plan she thought was premature. She'd been right. The patient was readmitted 4 days later. One she didn't know about and hadn't been shown. Effective today, Calloway said. Your employment at North Ridge Medical Center is terminated. She waited one breath before she spoke. On what grounds? The grounds I just described. None of those are terminable offenses under our HR policy. I can walk you through the section numbers, if that would help. Voss made a sound that might have been a laugh. Price looked at her folder. Calloway leaned forward slightly. The grounds don't need to satisfy your interpretation of policy, Mitchell. They need to satisfy ours. You've been a disruption on this unit since the day you arrived. You second-guess physicians, you create anxiety in patients, and you don't know your place in the hierarchy of this hospital. There it was, the real sentence, dressed up in the earlier ones. My place, Ava said. I need your badge before you leave this office. She unclipped it from her scrub top and set it on the desk. Not dropped, set. Then she stood up, because there was nothing left to do in that room. Calloway said, Security will escort you out. They sent 2 of them. Big guys, not unkind, just doing their job, walking slightly behind her and slightly to each side, the way that made it unmistakable what was happening while technically not touching her until she didn't move fast enough near the elevator. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor and the lobby spread out in front of her. Wide, high-ceilinged, the main entrance of a hospital that served 60,000 people a year in a mid-sized city that didn't have much else. Morning visiting hours were underway. There were families with coffee cups and get-well balloons. There were outpatients checking in at the desk. There were nurses and techs crossing between units. All of them saw. That was the thing about a termination escort that nobody who hadn't experienced it quite understood. It wasn't the losing of the job. It was the theater of the exit, the performance of your disgrace, staged in the one space where everyone who knew you would see it, designed to teach a lesson not just to you, but to everyone watching. Don't push back. Don't make trouble. Know your place. Ava walked through the lobby with her back straight and her face arranged into something neutral, which took effort she didn't show, and she watched people she'd worked with for 2 years find reasons to look somewhere else. Terrence at the patient transport desk. Julio from respiratory, who she'd once spent an hour with helping him chart a complex case. A cluster of student nurses from the university program she'd volunteered to mentor. All of them looked away. Almost all. Near the corridor to the break room, a small figure peeled off from the wall. Priya Suresh, an aide who'd been on the cardiac unit for 3 years and who had the quality of someone who noticed everything and commented on very little. She stepped into Ava's path just long enough to press something into her hand, folded, small, and then stepped back without making eye contact with the security guards. Get some rest, Priya said. That was all. Ava closed her fingers around whatever it was and kept walking. The automatic doors opened. The outside air hit her. March in Silver Creek, still cold, the kind of damp that got into your joints. She was in the parking lot and the security guards stopped at the entrance, their job done, the border of the hospital marked and enforced. She walked to her car. A 2017 Civic with a cracked side mirror she kept meaning to fix and hadn't. She got in. She put her hands on the wheel. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't capable of it, and not because she thought crying was weakness. She'd learned better than that in places that had tried to teach her worse. She didn't cry because crying right now would mean letting what just happened be the loudest thing, and she wasn't ready to give it that. She looked at her hand, opened it. Priya had given her a folded piece of paper and a small USB drive, the kind that cost $3 at a drugstore checkout. She unfolded the paper. They deleted the original telemetry record on Fitch from the system logs. I made a copy. Don't go back in through the front. P. Ava stared at the note for a long time. Then she put it in her jacket pocket, started the car, and pulled out of the lot. She drove without a destination for a while, which was something she did sometimes when her brain needed to process without being asked to produce anything. Silver Creek was flat in the middle and then hilly toward the east side, where the old neighborhoods climbed above the river, and she ended up on a ridge road without quite deciding to go there, parked at the overlook where high schoolers came at night and where she sometimes came alone because you could see a long way from there. She sat in the car with the engine off and looked at the city. 2 years. She had spent 2 years at North Ridge building something careful and deliberate. A second identity, a quiet life. A career that didn't require her to carry anything from before. She had been meticulous about it. She had arrived with a nursing degree earned during the years after she got out, chosen Silver Creek because it was far from Fort Bragg, and nobody here had any reason to know her name. She had taken the job at North Ridge because it was a decent hospital in a decent-sized city, and she could be unremarkable there, which was what she'd wanted. Unremarkable. Invisible. Safe. And she had been those things, mostly, until she stopped being able to watch a physician make a decision she was certain was wrong and stay quiet about it. That was the problem. She could disguise a lot about herself. She could not disguise that. She pulled out the USB drive and turned it over in her fingers. She thought about Mrs. Fitch. She thought about the telemetry strip she wasn't supposed to have. She was deciding what to do with that thought when she heard it, low at first, a vibration more than a sound, the kind of thing that traveled through the car chassis and the ground before it reached the ear. She knew that frequency. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, because there had been a long stretch of time when it meant everything about whether the next hour would be survivable. Rotors. She got out of the car. 3 helicopters were coming in from the northeast, low and fast, flying a pattern she recognized. It wasn't a news pattern, wasn't a life flight single bird response, wasn't a training exercise. It was a security movement pattern. Staggered altitude, overlapping coverage, the lead bird scanning while the others held. She had seen it over Kandahar. She had seen it over Mosul. She had not expected to see it over Silver Creek, Pennsylvania. She watched them descend toward the valley, toward the hospital. Her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She drove back. She didn't examine the decision. She just made it. By the time she got close enough to see North Ridge, the parking lot was already changing. 2 black SUVs were positioned at the main entrance. 3 more were staged at the side entrance near the emergency bay. As she pulled to a stop at the far edge of the visitor lot, outside the perimeter, not past it, she could see uniformed personnel moving with purpose along the building's exterior. They weren't police. The bearing was different. The equipment was different. She counted the vehicle configurations. She watched the formation. Inside the hospital, she could see through the lobby glass, distantly, imperfectly, that something had changed. The normal flow of foot traffic was stopped. Staff were clustered near the windows. Someone at the reception desk was on the phone, standing up, which people at that desk never did. Then the ambulance pulled in. No lights. No siren. That was the second thing that was wrong. Emergency vehicles in true high-priority situations often ran quiet on approach when they had escort, when drawing attention was a liability rather than an asset. The escort in this case was a 3rd black SUV, and the ambulance bay doors opened before the vehicle fully stopped, and the team that came out moved with the kind of practiced coordination that hospital emergency staff achieved only after years and that military medical teams achieved through a different kind of repetition entirely. Ava's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She couldn't see the patient from this distance. She could see the controlled urgency of the movement, the way the team flowing out of the ambulance was arranged not around the stretcher, but around something on the stretcher, a protective geometry she recognized. High-value transport, deteriorating condition. The vehicles and the personnel count told her the latter. If the patient were stable, they wouldn't be moving this fast. She reached into her bag without looking and found the notepad she carried for exactly no professional reason anymore. And she wrote down what she was observing, because old habits of situational documentation didn't die just because the situation changed. She was on her 3rd line of notes when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, Silver Creek area code, but not a contact. She answered. "Is this Ava Mitchell?" The voice was male, clipped, professional. "Who's asking?" This is Master Sergeant Dale Pruitt, assigned to the protection detail for Deputy Secretary Warren Hollis. I need to know if you're Ava Mitchell, formerly Staff Sergeant Mitchell, 75th Combat Support Hospital, 2 tours, evacuated out of Bagram in 2019. Ava was very still. "Where are you getting this information?" she said. Not a question. A statement of the fact that this was a thing she needed to know. "I don't have time to explain sourcing. I need an answer." "Yes," she said. "That's me." "Good." She heard background noise, voices, movement, the distinct echo of an institutional interior. "We have a critical situation. Deputy Secretary Hollis was transported to Northridge Medical Center approximately 9 minutes ago with a suspected traumatic injury pattern following an incident during transit. He's currently being assessed by the on-call team, but the attending physicians are," a pause, brief, "not converging on a diagnosis. We have a medical liaison officer who reviewed the injury presentation and flagged your name from a 2018 AAR. Ava knew what a 2018 AAR was. She knew which one he meant without being told, because there was only one from that year she'd contributed to that would have a flag like this attached to it. "What's the presentation?" she asked. "High mechanism blunt force, probable internal. They're calling it blunt abdominal trauma and prepping for a standard approach. Our liaison says the injury pattern doesn't fit that read." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. "Opened them. Delayed splenic rupture with a secondary tension pattern?" Silence on the line, then, "That's what he flagged. And the attendings are missing it because the initial vitals were deceivingly compensated." "That is the current situation, yes." She looked at the hospital building. She thought about the badge she'd set on Calloway's desk 4 hours ago. She thought about the security guards who'd walked her out. She thought about Voss's voice in the hallway, carrying deliberately, and the way Harlow had handed her that pink form with the careful look of someone who'd been asked to do it and had decided it wasn't her problem. "I was terminated this morning," she said. "I'm not authorized to practice in that facility." "With respect, Sergeant, I'm not calling you as a nurse." A beat. "There's a car on your 2 o'clock, Pruitt said. "Gray Suburban. He'll bring you in." She looked. There it was. 60 yards to her right, parked in a visitor spot. A gray Suburban with a man in civilian clothes standing beside it, already looking at her. She thought about Warren Hollis. She didn't know him personally. She knew his name from the kind of briefings that reached enlisted medics in the form of redacted summaries. She knew what he represented in terms of the decisions that determined whether people like her got deployed to the places she'd been deployed to, which was a complicated thing to know about a dying man. She thought about the specific injury pattern Pruitt had described. She thought about the compensated shock presentation, the way a body could look almost stable while the damage compounded in the background, the way attending physicians trained in civilian trauma would default to the most obvious explanation, because the less obvious one required a reference point most of them had never had. She thought about a hillside outside of Kandahar, 2018, an IED strike that put 3 soldiers on the ground at once, and the way she'd made a decision there under 3 seconds that had been reviewed, documented, and flagged in an after-action report that apparently had just traveled 4,000 miles in 2 years to find her in a parking lot in Silver Creek, Pennsylvania. She thought about all of that. Then she got out of the car. Ido. The man from the Suburban didn't say much, which she respected. He was young, military posture poorly disguised by civilian clothes, and he walked her around the east side of the building to a staff entrance she'd used 100 times before today. Except that today, there were 2 armed personnel flanking it who stepped aside when they saw her escort and didn't ask questions. Inside was different. The hospital was the same building she'd left 4 hours ago, but the atmosphere had compressed. Staff moved in tighter groups. Voices were lower. The overhead paging system had gone quiet in the way it did when someone administratively superior to the on-call administrator had asked it to. She passed 2 nurses she knew, and neither of them looked at her with the particular blankness of looking away. They just looked, and their expressions were unreadable, which was its own kind of information. Pruitt found her at the junction to the critical care corridor. He was maybe 40, compact and economical in his movements, with the kind of face that had been outdoors in harsh conditions enough times to carry it permanently. He extended a hand. Mitchell. Pruitt. She shook it. What are we looking at? Hollis came in with pressure in the low 90s, heart rate 110, alert and irritable. Vitals started to normalize over the first 20 minutes. The attending called for imaging, ran a fast, looked clean. They were moving toward observation and pain management when the liaison flagged the pattern. How long ago did the injury occur? 90 minutes prior to arrival, maybe 100. She did the math. The compensated window for the injury pattern she suspected ran 60 to 90 minutes before decompensation in a patient without prior cardiac history, maybe longer in someone fit and high-functioning. Then the cliff. Where is he now? Bay 3. They've got him on a monitor. Attending is Weston, surgical. He's... Pruitt paused. He's confident. The way he said confident told her everything. Take me there, she said. They moved down the corridor. She registered peripherally that they passed Harlow's nursing station, registered it the way you registered a landmark, without assignment of significance, though she was aware that Harlow saw her and that the scene produced a visible interruption in whatever Harlow had been doing. Bay 3 had a half-drawn curtain. Through the gap she could see monitors, a surgical team in partial prep, and Dr. Carl Weston. She'd heard of him, never worked directly with him, general surgery attending with a reputation for decisive action and a corresponding reputation for decisiveness that occasionally outpaced information. He was speaking when she came in. He didn't stop immediately. Going to scope it, get a clean look, and if the source is what I think it is, we'll have him in the OR within the hour. Dr. Weston. Pruitt's voice was not loud, but it occupied the room. This is Ava Mitchell. She's been requested by the protection detail. Weston looked at her. He registered the scrubs. She was still in her scrubs, her name tag hole empty where the badge had been. And then he looked at Pruitt and the two soldiers who'd followed them in. I'm not aware of any consultation request. It's not a consultation, Pruitt said. It's a personnel request from the protection detail. This is my patient in my... On the monitor, something changed. Ava was already at the bedside before Weston finished the sentence. Warren Hollis was 61, gray-haired, barrel-chested, in the way of a man who'd been athletic young and kept the frame, if not entirely the condition. His color had been shifting in the last 30 seconds. She could see it in the monitors and in his skin, the subtle draining of compensatory capacity that preceded collapse. She put her hand on his wrist. His pulse was there, was still there, but it had changed quality. Mr. Hollis, she said, I need you to tell me where the pain is right now, not where it was, right now. He looked at her. His eyes were sharp. She'd heard he was sharp, and that was its own reassurance, because sharp patients gave you information. Left shoulder, he said. His voice was strained. Started maybe 5 minutes ago. Nobody asked. Left shoulder, Care's sign, referred pain from diaphragmatic irritation by blood pooling in the peritoneal cavity. She looked at the monitor, looked at Weston. He's decompensating, she said. You have minutes, maybe less. This is a delayed splenic rupture with hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity. The fast missed it because the initial bleed was slow and the scan was done in the first compensated window. He needs the OR right now, not in an hour. Weston stared at her. Who are you? Someone who's seen this before. She turned to the nearest nurse. Get the OR team on immediate standby. Type and cross if it hasn't been done. And I need a repeat BP, both arms, right now. She doesn't have privileges in this hospital, Weston said, addressing the room. No. Pruitt stepped forward. She doesn't. That's your decision to make, doctor, and I'd suggest you make it in the next 30 seconds. The monitor alarm went off. Hollis's blood pressure dropped 12 points in one reading. His eyes went to Ava. Not to Weston, not to the soldiers. To her. You're sure, he said. Not a question. A man doing his own assessment of someone who was giving him one. She met his eyes. Yes. Weston was already moving. She gave him that. He was fast when the choice became obvious. Barking at his team, reaching for his phone, the OR call going out in pieces, even as the room began to reorganize itself around the emergency it had just officially become. And in the middle of that organized chaos, with the monitor still alarming and the team moving, and Pruitt on his radio and the soldiers creating a perimeter she wasn't part of, Ava Mitchell stood at the bedside of a man she hadn't known 40 minutes ago and felt the particular calm that came over her in these moments. The calm that had no other context in her life except this one, that she had tried to leave behind and apparently had not, that lived in her hands and her eyes and the specific part of her brain that had been trained in conditions most of the people in this room couldn't imagine. Down the corridor, she heard the automatic doors to the main lobby open, and then she heard boots. Not the soft-soled movement of hospital staff or the click of dress shoes or the irregular rhythm of visitors. The specific cadence of military boots moving in formation, more of them than she'd seen in the parking lot, and a voice she didn't recognize from here but whose register and authority she recognized the way she'd recognize a language she'd been fluent in. The voice was asking for her name, asking everyone in the lobby, clearly, loudly, with the particular tone that meant this wasn't a question being asked in hopes of an answer. It was a statement being broadcast, a signal being sent, an arrival that was also a declaration. And the declaration was, "We're here. We know who she is, and we know what you did." The boots came first, and then the voices, and then the lobby of Northridge Medical Center stopped being a hospital lobby in any functional sense and became something else entirely. Ava heard it from Bay 3, the formation entering through the main doors, the way the ambient sound of the building shifted when a large number of people moved into a space with purpose. She didn't turn away from Hollis. She didn't move. She stayed where she was while Weston's team prepped the transport and the monitor ticked through its alarming cycle. And she listened to the lobby the way she'd learned to listen to environments, not for specific sounds, but for what the totality of the sound meant. What it meant right now was that whoever had just walked into Northridge had not come to negotiate. Pruitt's radio crackled. He stepped back from the bedside and spoke into it quietly, and she caught fragments. Confirmed. Yes. Bay 3. Stand by. His face, when he turned back, was composed in the way of someone receiving information that was significant but not surprising. "They're asking for you in the lobby," he said. "I'm in the middle of something." "They know. They'll wait." Weston's team was moving Hollis onto the transport gurney, the OR nurse rattling off the handoff checklist in the clipped shorthand that came with genuine emergency. Hollis himself was pale, his pressure trending down, but his eyes were still tracking. He caught Ava's gaze as they began to wheel him out. "You're coming?" he asked. "I can't go into the OR." She said it plainly, without apology. "I'm not authorized, but Dr. Weston knows what he's looking at now. You'll be okay." Weston, moving beside the gurney, didn't respond to that. Whether he agreed with the diagnosis or simply had no better option, he had stopped arguing about it, and in her experience that was close enough to validation to work with. She watched them wheel Hollis out. Then she turned and followed Pruitt toward the lobby. The scene she walked into was not what she'd expected, and she'd expected something significant. There were 12 soldiers. That was the first thing she counted, because counting was what her brain did automatically in environments that required assessment, and 12 was more than a protection detail warranted and more than a medical liaison mission required. They were positioned in a loose formation in the center of the lobby, and the word loose was doing a lot of work in that description, because the looseness was the looseness of a group that had arranged itself precisely and could stop being loose inside of 2 seconds. In the center of the formation was a man she recognized, not personally. From a photograph, years old, taken at a ceremony she'd attended peripherally, on the edge of an event she hadn't been the center of. Colonel James Rutherford, who had at that time been a lieutenant colonel, who had signed the paperwork on 2 of her deployments, who had also, and this was the part she hadn't thought about in 2 years, co-authored the after-action review from Kandahar in 2018 that apparently still lived somewhere in a file attached to her name. He was 50-something now, lean, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of expression that didn't need rank insignia to communicate authority. Around the perimeter of the lobby stood the Northridge staff, nurses, orderlies, a cluster of administrative personnel near the elevators, watching in the paralyzed way of people witnessing something outside their category of experience. She saw Harlow among them, her clipboard pressed flat against her chest, her face composed into the professional neutrality of someone doing their best not to show what they were feeling. She saw Julio from respiratory, not looking away this time. She saw two of the student nurses very still. She did not see Calloway. She did not see Voss. Rutherford looked at her when she came through the corridor door, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated, the way a person recalibrates when they've been operating on partial information and the missing piece has just walked through a door. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," he said. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Civilian, former." "I'm aware of both things." He didn't extend his hand. He didn't need to. "I'm also aware that you identified a presenting injury pattern in the last 20 minutes that the attending surgical team missed on 2 prior assessments. I flagged a possibility. Dr. Weston made the call." "He made the call after you told him what to call." "There was no edge in it, just accuracy." "That's what I'm aware of." A beat. She waited. "I was told you were terminated this morning," he said. "I was, before you identified the injury pattern. About 4 hours before." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the 12 soldiers were motionless in the way that motionless people were motionless when they were very much paying attention. "I'd like to know," Rutherford said, "the circumstances." She almost said it's not relevant. She almost said what's relevant is that your deputy secretary is on his way to surgery and should be fine. She almost deflected it entirely because that was the reflex. Keep the focus on the mission, minimize the personal component, do the job and don't make it about yourself. Instead, she said, "That's a long conversation." "I have time." "I don't know if I do." She looked at the lobby around her. "This building terminated my access this morning. I'm not sure I'm legally supposed to be standing here." Rutherford turned slightly to look at the assembled staff. The collective gaze of 12 soldiers followed his. "Is there a member of hospital administration present?" he asked, at the room in general, at a volume that didn't require any particular effort to carry. Silence for 2 seconds. Then the elevator opened and Paul Calloway walked out, and Ava understood that he'd been notified and had taken the elevator rather than the stairs, which told her something about what he'd been doing in the interval. Composing himself, preparing a position. His tie was straightened, his jacket buttoned, his face carrying the particular arrangement of cooperative authority that she recognized as the thing people wore when they were trying to look in control of something they weren't. "Colonel," Calloway said, extending a hand. "Paul Calloway, hospital director. We weren't notified of this visit." "No," Rutherford said, not taking the hand. "You weren't. Is there a space where we can speak privately? Administration offices, conference room, something adequate." "Of course. My office is on the 4th. Somewhere on this floor. We'll want the conversation accessible." Calloway's expression tightened fractionally. He gestured toward the administrative conference room off the main lobby, the one used for quarterly board meetings and press communications. It had glass walls on one side and a long table and chairs that nobody had sat in comfortably since the furniture had been chosen for aesthetics over function. "That'll work," Rutherford said. He looked at Ava. "I'd like you in that room. My presence might complicate." "Your presence is the point. Not harsh, just final." She went. Mbati. The room filled with more people than it was designed for, comfortably. Rutherford and 2 of his officers at one end of the table, Calloway and, appearing from somewhere, Sandra Price from HR at the other. Ava in the middle because there was no natural side for her, which was its own kind of statement. Harlow appeared in the doorway and Rutherford's aide said, "Come in or don't." And she came in and stood against the glass wall. Rutherford set a tablet on the table. He didn't open it yet. Deputy Secretary Hollis was in Silver Creek for a meeting related to a federal infrastructure grant that this region is in the process of receiving, Rutherford said. "That's public information. The nature of the incident that led to his injury is not public information and won't become so. So I'll ask that what I'm about to say stays in this room." Everyone nodded. Ava watched Calloway nod with the micro-expression of someone who was thinking very hard about something adjacent to what was being said. During transit, the vehicle carrying the deputy secretary was involved in an incident. He sustained injury that was initially assessed as moderate blunt trauma. His security team made the determination to transport to the nearest qualified facility. Rutherford looked at the table surface for a moment, then up. That facility is this one. His condition on arrival appeared to have stabilized, which turned out to be clinically misleading. Calloway said, "Our team provided immediate and appropriate. Your team missed a delayed hemorrhage that a nurse you fired this morning identified correctly." Rutherford's voice didn't change temperature. "Let me be direct, Director, because I don't have the patience for the alternate version of this conversation. Deputy Secretary Hollis is currently in surgery for a condition your attending physician failed to identify. He is in surgery because this woman," he looked at Ava, "recognized an injury pattern that your staff couldn't, and she did it from a parking lot after being walked out of your building by security." The glass wall behind Harlow reflected the lobby beyond. Ava could see in that reflection that the lobby staff had not dispersed. They were still there, most of them, clustered in the visible range of the conference room's glass side. Calloway said, "I'm not aware of the specifics of this morning's personnel decision, but I can assure you that it followed proper." "Then I'd like you to become aware of the specifics." Rutherford opened the tablet. "Because I've spent the last 2 hours on the phone with people who are aware of the specifics, and what they've told me is inconsistent with the word proper in any sense I recognize." Price made a small movement beside Calloway. The kind of movement that was almost invisible and was exactly the kind of thing Ava noticed. "Nurse Mitchell," Rutherford said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like you to answer them as plainly as you can." Ava looked at him. "All right." "You were terminated today on grounds of patient agitation, deviation from physician orders, and insubordination." "That's what I was told." "Do those grounds accurately describe what occurred this morning?" She thought about how to answer that, not because she was uncertain of the truth, but because accuracy required more than a yes or no. "I made a clinical observation about a patient's telemetry pattern that differed from the attending physician's assessment. I documented my concern in the chart and raised it verbally once. The patient subsequently experienced a sustained ventricular tachycardia event consistent with the concern I'd raised." "Doctor, Voss submitted a formal complaint and I was called to the director's office and terminated." She paused. "My clinical conduct was within nursing scope. My documentation was appropriate. I didn't deviate from any physician order. I fulfilled them and additionally documented my clinical concern, which is standard practice." Rutherford looked at Calloway. "Director, there's a formal complaint on file from a physician you apparently support over a nurse you apparently don't." He looked back at the tablet. "I'm looking at your facility's HR record for Nurse Mitchell. I'm looking at a pattern of," he scrolled, "3 documented complaints in 2 years. I'm also looking at a series of nursing assessment notes across that same period, patient outcome correlations that the quality department apparently hasn't reviewed in aggregate. We had people do that review in the last 90 minutes. He looked up. "She's been right. More often than your attending physicians would like documented." The room was very quiet. Calloway said nothing. For the first time since entering the room, he said absolutely nothing, and the nothing was loud. Price, to her credit, had the particular stillness of someone who had already understood where this was going and was doing the math on their own position. Ava watched it happen in real time, the slight shift in how Price was oriented relative to Calloway, the marginal increase in distance that wasn't physical but was visible. "I'm going to tell you what happens next," Rutherford said. "I'm going to tell you not as a threat, but because I've found that clarity is more useful than ambiguity." He folded his hands on the table. "There will be an investigation into the circumstances of this morning's termination. That investigation will be conducted by an independent party and will review the full personnel record, the incident complaint, and the clinical record for the relevant patient cases. There will also be a federal inquiry into this facility's handling of the Deputy Secretary's care, which is standard protocol in any situation involving an injury to a protected official." He let that sit. "If those 2 investigations produce findings consistent with what I'm already looking at, the consequences for the individuals responsible for this morning's decision will be significant and professional in nature. That's not a promise. That's a statistical likelihood based on what I'm reading on this screen." Calloway's jaw had set. Price was looking at a point on the table approximately 18 inches from her own hands. At the moment, Rutherford said, my immediate concern is Deputy Secretary Hollis and his recovery. My secondary concern is the woman sitting across this table from you, who identified the condition that is keeping him alive and who was escorted out of this building like a shoplifter before she did it. He looked at Ava directly. Your clearance to practice in this facility hasn't technically been reinstated. That's an administrative process I can't shortcut, but I'd like you to remain on site while the Deputy Secretary is in surgery as a resource for the surgical team if needed. Weston won't want me anywhere near that OR. Weston is doing his job and doing it well, from the update I just received. I'm not asking you to scrub in, I'm asking you to be available. She nodded. Is there anything you need? He asked. And the question was direct in a way that felt unusual in this room, in this building, in this context, asked without performance, without agenda, as a simple operational inquiry. She thought about Priya's note. She thought about the USB drive in her jacket pocket, the copy of the telemetry record that had apparently been deleted from the system. She thought about Mrs. Fitch, who was in the ICU upstairs, and who Ava had not been allowed to follow up on, and whose outcome she didn't know. I need to check on a patient upstairs, she said. Dolores Fitch, cardiac step-down, transferred to ICU this morning. She was the patient at the center of this morning's complaint. Rutherford looked at his aide. The aide looked at Calloway. Calloway said, through something that was trying to be a cooperative tone, I'll authorize a temporary access pass. Thank you, Rutherford said, in a way that meant that's the first reasonable thing you've said. She went up alone, which was how she wanted it. The ICU on the third floor was quieter than the floors below, which was always true. The ICU had its own ecology, its own specific hush broken by the rhythmic languages of machines. She'd spent a lot of time in spaces like it. She'd spent time in worse versions of it, overseas, where the rhythm of machines was the same, but the smell was different, and the sounds from outside the building were different, and the people inside the beds had gotten there in ways that were different in kind, if not always in degree. The charge nurse at the ICU station was a man named Torres, who recognized her and had the grace to look uncertain rather than hostile. She explained what Rutherford had authorized. He looked at the temporary pass Calloway's assistant had printed. It still had her name wrong. Mitchell, Ava J, instead of Mitchell, Ava K. But it existed. And he let her through. Dolores Fitch was in Bay 6. She was awake, which was the first good thing. She was awake and tethered to a more sophisticated monitor than she'd had downstairs. And the readout on that monitor was sinus rhythm, regular, appropriately paced. The cardioversion she'd apparently received after the ICU transfer had done what it was supposed to do. She was sitting up slightly. When she saw Ava, something in her face rearranged itself. They said you weren't going to be able to come up, she said. They were right this morning. Things changed. Fitch looked at her with the particular evaluation of a woman who had lived long enough to distinguish between things that changed for good reasons and things that changed for reasons that looked good. What happened? To me or to you? Both. Ava sat in the chair beside the bed. You had a sustained VTAC event this morning after I called for help with your rhythm. You're in the ICU now. The cardioversion worked. Your rhythm looks stable. I know all that. Fitch's eyes were steady. I heard the alarms. I know what happened to me. I'm asking what happened to you. A pause. The aide, the small woman, Priya. She came up after the transfer. She told me you'd been let go. Ava was quiet for a moment. That's accurate. Because of this morning. Because of me. Not because of you. Because of what I said about you, and who didn't want to hear it. Fitch looked at the ceiling briefly. When she looked back, her expression had something iron in it. I want to file a formal complaint against Dr. Voss and against whoever made the decision to... Mrs. Fitch, Ava kept her voice level. There are already people looking into the situation. You don't need to do anything right now except rest and let your heart stabilize. I'm 63, not incapacitated. I know my rights. You do, and they'll be relevant soon. But right now, the most important thing you can do for any of this is recover. because you're going to need to give a clear account of this morning at some point, and that account is going to matter. Fitch looked at her, assessing. Then, you're not just saying that to calm me down. No. All right. She settled back against the pillow, not entirely convinced, but choosing to accept it. You'll come back. It wasn't a question. Ava recognized that. The way sick people sometimes made declarative statements that were actually requests, because requests felt too vulnerable. Yes, she said. I'll come back. She left Fitch resting and went back into the ICU corridor, and that was where she ran into Dr. Randall Voss. He was coming out of the adjacent bay, chart in hand, and he stopped when he saw her with the particular arrested quality of a person who had not expected to see a thing they'd been responsible for removing. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he said, "You shouldn't be up here. I have a temporary access pass." "Issued by whom?" "Administration." She kept her voice even. "Authorized by Colonel Rutherford." Something moved across Voss's face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Something in between, the expression of a man who'd understood about 20 minutes ago that the day was going in a direction he hadn't anticipated and was still in the process of figuring out how badly. "That's irregular," he said. "A lot of things this morning were irregular." She looked at him. Not combatively. She was too tired for the energy that would require, and the anger she felt was the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need to be performed. "How's the patient in Bay 5?" she asked, because she'd glanced at the monitor board, and Bay 5 had readings she wanted an explanation for, and old habits. He blinked. "That's not troponin trend or rhythm issue, because from the board it looks like a rhythm issue, but the delta on the enzyme makes me think it might be both." He stared at her. The chart in his hand had gone still. "That's not your patient," he finally said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." She moved past him toward the elevator. "You should probably go back in there." She didn't hear him move immediately. She heard him standing still in the corridor, which was perhaps worse for him. Downstairs, the lobby had transformed again. The military personnel were deployed differently now. Some still inside. Several moved to positions outside the building. The configuration shifting as the surgical update apparently came in. She found Pruitt near the corridor junction, and his posture told her before his words did. "He's out," Pruitt said. "OR team closed him. Weston says the bleed was in the splenic hilum, exactly where your assessment indicated. Lost about 4 units during the procedure. He'll be in recovery for the next hour minimum, ICU for at least 2 days." He paused. Weston sent a message. "What kind?" Pruitt almost smiled. The kind where a man says he wants to discuss the presentation in detail at the earliest opportunity, which in Weston's language apparently means he's impressed, and won't be saying it directly. She absorbed that. "Hollis is going to be all right." "Barring complications, yes." She stood there in the corridor for a moment, in the particular aftermath of an emergency resolved, which had its own texture. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the specific settling that came when the thing you'd been braced for didn't happen. She'd lived in that feeling before, many times, in different contexts. It never quite normalized. "Mitchell." Rutherford was behind her. He'd come silently from the direction of the conference room, which was apparently something colonels could do. "He's stable," she said. "I know." He fell into step beside her, though they weren't walking anywhere in particular. "I've also had a report from the Federal Oversight Liaison. The investigation into this morning's personnel action is formally opened." She nodded. She wasn't sure what to do with that. "There's something else," he said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. "When your service record came up in the liaison's review, there were things in it that you may not know have been surfaced at the federal level." She looked at him. "What kind of things?" "The kind that involve an ongoing inquiry." He was choosing his words, and the care of the choosing was its own signal. "I can't give you details in this corridor, but I want you to be aware that the investigation into this hospital is not going to be limited to this morning's termination. It may reach into the decision-making structure of this administration in ways that—" he paused, "in ways that will affect more than your employment status." "You're telling me to prepare for something." I'm telling you that you've stepped into a situation that was already in motion before you walked out of that OR. He met her eyes. Do you understand what I'm saying? She thought about Priya's note. She thought about the USB drive. She thought about the 3 items in her personnel file: the complaint from Harlow, the care conference notation, and the third one she'd never been shown, the one that apparently existed and had been used against her. I have something, she said. A copy of a telemetry record. I was told the original was deleted from the system logs. Rutherford went very still. I have it on a drive, she said. I haven't reviewed it yet, but the person who gave it to me indicated that the deletion was deliberate. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. Where is it? In my jacket. I want that in the hands of the federal liaison within the next 30 minutes. Chain of custody needs to be clean. He glanced toward the conference room where one of his officers was visible through the glass. Don't show it to anyone in this building first. No one. Do you understand? She did. She understood it in the way that the request was about more than evidence protocol. It was about the boundary between who could be trusted in this building and who couldn't, and that boundary was being drawn very carefully, and the drawing of it told her something about how bad the thing underneath was. I understand, she said. He nodded. He moved toward the conference room. She stood in the corridor with the USB drive in her pocket, and the weight of whatever was on it pressing against her in a way that had nothing to do with its physical weight, which was barely there. The federal liaison was a woman named Desjardins, 40-ish, gray blazer, the kind of face that had been professionally neutral for so long, the neutrality had become its resting state. She met Ava in a side office off the lobby, one of the small rooms used by social workers and patient advocates, rarely occupied. She had a laptop open and a chain of custody form already on the table, which meant she had been expecting something like this before Rutherford had even told her to expect it. Ava handed over the drive. She gave her account of how it had come into her possession. She answered the questions Desjardins asked, which were specific, detailed, and asked in the sequence of someone who already had a structure built and was placing information into it. The employee who gave you this, Desjardins said. Priya Suresh. Yes. She's still on shift? She was when I came in. I don't know if she's been approached. Desjardins made a note. We'll need her account. I'll handle that contact. She looked up from her laptop. You should know that the drive isn't the only piece of evidence in play. The quality review Colonel Rutherford mentioned, that was done on short notice, but it produced a preliminary finding that we'll be acting on. She closed the laptop. I can't tell you the content of that finding at this stage. But it's consistent with what I've been saying. Desjardins looked at her with something that was almost wry. It's consistent with a pattern I've seen before in facilities under administrative pressure to control outcomes and manage liability. She stood. That's all I can say. Ava stood as well. What happens now? Now you wait? That's the hard part, I know, but the process needs to move at its own pace. She picked up the chain of custody form. You should also know that a decision regarding your temporary access to this facility will need to be made in the next few hours. Given the circumstances, I don't think you'll be asked to leave. But that decision sits with administration, not with me or with Colonel Rutherford, and administration is currently, she chose the word, recalibrating. Recalibrating. That was a way to put it. Ava found an empty chair in the family waiting area off the lobby, one of those beige carpeted rooms with stacking chairs and a television on a high mount, cycling through a local news broadcast with the sound muted. She sat down because her legs were telling her she'd been standing most of the last several hours, and there was nothing more she could do right now that required standing. The television was showing a local news segment, footage of a press pool outside a federal building 2 cities away, a banner across the bottom that she couldn't quite read from this distance. She was trying to read it when the door to the waiting room opened. She expected Pruitt, or one of Rutherford's aides, or possibly Desjardins with a follow-up question. It was Linda Harlow. Harlow came in and closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the room with her clipboard gone for the first time in Ava's memory, her arms at her sides, and the professional neutrality that was usually her whole bearing was absent, and what was underneath it was more complicated. Ava waited. The Fitch case, Harlow said. The original telemetry strip. What about it? I didn't know it had been deleted. Her voice was flat. She said it the way people said things when they were trying to be accurate and were also struggling to say it at all. I knew Voss was going to file the complaint. I knew it was going to go to Callaway. I didn't know anyone had touched the system records. Ava looked at her. She didn't know what to do with that yet, so she held it and didn't respond. I've worked with Voss for 7 years, Harlow said. I know what he's like. And I should have... She stopped. I should have looked harder at the documentation before I handed you that form. Why didn't you? It wasn't an accusation, it was a question. Ava asked it with genuine curiosity because it was the question that mattered, and Harlow's answer to it would tell her something about what Harlow understood about what she'd done. Because it was easier not to, Harlow said. The flatness again. Because Callaway makes it easier when you don't push back on his decisions. Because... She looked at the floor for a moment. Because you'd been difficult, and I told myself that made it simpler. That the complaint was justified even if the grounds were weak, because the underlying dynamics were real. She looked up. That's not something I'm proud of. No, Ava agreed. I'm going to give a statement to the investigators. I know. Harlow looked at her with something that was part surprise and part something else. The recalibration of someone who had expected more reaction and was adjusting to the absence of it. I'm not asking you to. I'm not looking for anything from you. I just wanted you to know. I appreciate that, Ava said. She meant it, and she didn't mean anything beyond it. Harlow nodded once. She left. Ava sat in the empty room and breathed. The television cycled. The news banner scrolled past again, and this time she was close enough. She read, Federal inquiry opened into regional hospital network. Sources say North Ridge Medical Center among facilities under review. She looked at the timestamp in the corner of the broadcast. It had been filed 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago, she'd been standing in the parking lot with Pruitt's number on her screen. She sat very still. The inquiry wasn't a response to today. It hadn't been opened because of today. It had already been open. The investigation that Rutherford and Desjardins were conducting had a pre-existing structure. Today had walked into something that was already in motion, something larger than one termination, larger than one complaint, larger than one deleted telemetry file. She thought about what Rutherford had said in the corridor. You've stepped into a situation that was already in motion before you walked out of that OR. She thought about the third notation in her personnel file, the one she'd never been shown, the one that had been used against her today but that she hadn't been aware of, had never been shown, had never been asked to respond to, had simply appeared in Callaway's summary of the grounds for her termination. She thought about why someone would put a notation in a personnel file without telling the subject of it. She thought about the circumstances under which that would be useful. She thought about the kind of person who planned ahead for the moment they might need to remove someone and made sure the paperwork existed to justify it. She thought about what she might have seen, or documented, or said in a care conference, or noted in a chart, without knowing it was significant, that would make her removal useful to someone who is managing a situation larger than one physician's complaint. The television news banner scrolled past a second time, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different area code from Pruitt's. Not Silver Creek, not a Pennsylvania number. Something she didn't recognize. She answered. The voice that came through was not Pruitt's. It wasn't Rutherford's. It was a woman's voice, older, careful, with the exact cadence of someone who was reading from nothing and choosing every word independently. Nurse Mitchell. My name is Elaine Varga. I'm an attorney working with the Office of the Inspector General. I've been asked to make contact with you. A pause. I understand you've spoken with a federal liaison at North Ridge in the last hour. I have. Good. Then you understand there's an open inquiry. Another pause, this one different. Not hesitation, but the pause of someone who was about to say something that required its own space. I need you to understand that the inquiry is broader than what the liaison has indicated to you, and I need to ask you something that may be uncomfortable. Ava looked at the television, at the scrolling banner. Ask, she said. We have a record Of a notation in your personnel file that was added 3 months ago, Varga said. It references a specific incident in the oncology unit, a care conference where you flagged a discrepancy in a patient's treatment documentation. The notation frames it as an insubordination incident, but our review of the conference record suggests it was something else. Ava went still. She remembered the care conference. She remembered the discrepancy, a patient's chemotherapy dosage record that didn't match the pharmacy dispensing log, a gap of 11 days during which the documented dosage and the actual dispensing didn't align. She'd raised it. She'd been told it was a billing error, a transcription issue, that it had been corrected. She had documented her concern, as she documented everything, and then she had moved forward because moving forward was the job. She had not known it had been annotated in her file. She had not known it had not been corrected. "Tell me what you found," she said. Varga said, "Ms. Mitchell, the discrepancy you flagged 3 months ago was not a billing error. It was the surface presentation of a pattern of systematic overcharging that has been occurring in this facility for at least 18 months. The investigation is currently reviewing records across 47 patients." She let that number breathe. "You were the only clinical staff member who noticed and formally documented it, which is why your removal from this facility today," a pause, "was not a coincidence." The waiting room was very quiet. "You were targeted," Varga said. "We believe the termination was arranged specifically to remove you before you encountered further evidence." She paused again. "The problem is that in removing you, they put Deputy Secretary Hollis at risk, and that, for the first time something in her voice shifted slightly, has changed the calculus of how fast we move." Ava looked at the door. At the closed door in the lobby beyond it, where soldiers were stationed and administrators were recalibrating, and a charge nurse had just confessed, and a doctor was somewhere in this building who had been used and had let himself be used and probably didn't fully understand yet how far that went. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Everything you remember about that care conference," Varga said, "and anything else you've documented in any form that touches those 47 patients." Ava thought about the notebooks. The small one she'd kept because the habit was too old to break. The same habit she'd had in the Army, the documentation reflex. The record for its own sake, because records were the only thing that remained after the situation changed. She had notebooks going back 2 years. "I have documentation," she said slowly. Varga's voice did something then, not quite relief, but close to it. The sound of an investigation that had been missing a piece and had just been told where the piece might be. "When can you make it available?" she asked. Ava looked at the door again. On the other side of it, she could hear boots, not coming toward her, moving through the lobby, purposeful, the sound of a perimeter being repositioned. And under that, barely audible through the walls, the specific ambient shift of an institutional space in the process of changing hands. And then clearly, from the lobby, Calloway's voice, raised in a way she'd never heard it raised, saying something she couldn't quite make out, the words muffled by the walls. And then Rutherford's voice, level, carrying, clear even through the door. What Rutherford said was, "Director Calloway, I need you to step away from that elevator." Ava told Varga she'd call back, ended the call, and pushed through the waiting room door into the lobby. What she walked into was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. No raised fists, no shouting match. It was something more precise and therefore more dangerous. Rutherford stood 6 feet from Calloway, with 2 of his officers flanking at angles, and Calloway had the elevator call button depressed behind him, and the space between them had the particular charge of a situation that had moved past negotiation into something that didn't have a polite name. Price was near the reception desk, not looking at Calloway. That was the tell. "I have legal counsel," Calloway said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. "Any formal questioning requires their presence, and I'm not questioning you, Director." Rutherford's hands were at his sides. "I'm asking you not to leave the building until the liaison has completed her preliminary intake. That's a request, not a detainment. You're free to refuse it." The implication of refusing it was left completely unspoken, which was more effective than saying it. Calloway's jaw moved. He looked past Rutherford and saw Ava in the corridor entrance, and something in his face did a thing she recognized, the micro-recalculation of a person who had been operating on an assumption that was no longer valid. The assumption that she was gone, that what had happened this morning was over, that the day had been managed. He pressed the elevator button again. The doors opened. "Paul." It was Price from the reception desk. Her voice was quiet. "Don't." Calloway looked at her. The elevator dinged its arrival. He looked at Rutherford. He looked at the two officers, and then at the soldiers stationed near the main entrance, and then, finally, briefly, at Ava, in a way that was the closest she'd seen him come to revealing what was actually behind the administrative architecture. He took his hand off the button. The elevator doors closed. "Conference room," Rutherford said, not asking. Ava didn't go into the conference room this time. She didn't need to. She went to the family waiting area adjacent to the surgical wing, and she called Varga back, and she spent 22 minutes on the phone doing what Varga had asked, walking through the care conference, the specific discrepancy, the pharmacy log gap, the sequence of what she'd said and what she'd been told, and how she'd documented it. Varga listened the way trained investigators listened, without commentary, with occasional precise questions, recording every detail into a structure Ava couldn't see but could sense being built. When they finished, Varga said, "The notebooks. I need to know what level of detail we're working with. Daily entries. Patient adjacent. No PHI by name. I anonymized by bed number and date. Clinical observations, care decisions, points of concern. My documentation format from the military." She paused. "I didn't do it because I thought I'd need it for this. I did it because I've never been able to stop." A beat. "How far back do the entries go?" "From the day I started at North Ridge. 2 years, almost continuous." The silence on Varga's end lasted long enough that Ava could hear other voices in the background of wherever she was. A busy office, multiple conversations, the ambient sounds of a machine that had been running for a while and was now moving faster. "Ms. Mitchell," Varga said, "those notebooks may be the most significant single piece of documentation in this inquiry. I need you to understand that." "I understand. Can you get them today?" "They're at my apartment. I'm 20 minutes from here." "Don't go alone." Ava looked up. Pruitt was in the doorway of the waiting room, apparently finished with whatever he'd been doing in the lobby. He had the look of a man who was between assignments and available. "I can manage that," she said. Plus, Pruitt drove. He didn't ask questions, which she appreciated, and she didn't explain beyond what he needed to know, which was the address and the fact that she needed to retrieve materials that were going to the federal liaison. He nodded, and they went, and Silver Creek moved past the windows in the late afternoon light. The flat middle of the city, then the hill road, then her street, which was the kind of street that had been better 20 years ago and was surviving on the momentum of that. Her apartment was on the second floor of a building that had been a different kind of building in a previous decade. She went up while Pruitt waited at the bottom of the stairs, his hand not visibly near anything but the position of his body radiating a particular alertness that was its own kind of reassurance. Inside, she went to the closet. On the high shelf, behind a box of winter gear she hadn't touched since January, were the notebooks. 11 of them, composition books. The same kind she'd used downrange because they were cheap and durable and didn't fall apart if they got wet. She pulled them all down. She put them in the bag she used for overnight shifts, the large one, and she did a quick scan of the apartment with the specific eye of someone checking that nothing else was relevant. On the kitchen counter was her laptop, and on the laptop was 2 years of saved nursing literature and course notes and nothing of clinical significance. But also, in the downloads folder, time-stamped 4 months ago, a PDF she'd saved from the hospital's internal quality portal during a period when she'd had portal access for a continuing education module. She stood in front of the laptop. The PDF was a quality audit summary, routine document, the kind that got uploaded to the portal and that most staff never opened. She'd opened it because she'd been waiting for a module to load and clicked the wrong thing, and she'd skimmed it and thought it was unremarkable. And then she'd saved it for reasons she hadn't fully examined at the time. She opened it now. She read it with the eyes of someone who had spent the last 3 hours having a framework built for her, and what had seemed unremarkable 4 months ago was not unremarkable anymore. The audit summary was for the oncology unit. The period it covered included the 11-day gap in the pharmacy records she'd flagged in the care conference. The summary noted the gap. It categorized it as a reconciliation discrepancy. It was signed off by 2 administrators. One of them was Paul Calloway. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment. Then she took the laptop. Back at North Ridge, the building had changed again in the way it kept changing. Each time she entered, something had shifted in the internal weather, the way the staff moved, the particular arrangement of presences and absences that told you something about power if you knew how to read it. Calloway was not visible in the lobby. Neither was Price. Desjardins was. She was at the reception desk with a second person Ava didn't recognize, both of them with laptops open, and when she saw Ava come in with the bag and the laptop, she stood up and said, "Good. Come here." Ava came. She put the bag on the desk and explained the notebooks. She explained the laptop. She pulled up the PDF and showed Desjardins the signatory at the bottom of the audit summary. Desjardins looked at it. She looked at it for a while without speaking. Then she turned to the person beside her and said something in a low voice, and that person picked up a phone. "When was this accessed?" Desjardins asked. 4 months ago, time-stamped. I can show you the download history. I'll need the full chain." Desjardins was already reaching for her chain of custody form. This is significant, Ms. Mitchell. You understand what you're looking at here." "Calloway knew about the discrepancy before I flagged it in the care conference," Ava said. "His signature is on the audit that documented it. He signed off on categorizing it as a reconciliation error and closing it." "Yes. Which means when I raised it formally, he knew exactly what I'd found, and he knew I documented it." "Yes." Desjardins met her eyes. "And 3 months later, a notation appeared in your personnel file." The sequence was complete. The notation, the one she'd never been shown, the one Calloway had cited this morning, hadn't been created because of any conduct issue. It had been created as a preemptive instrument. Insurance. A paper trail built to justify a removal that hadn't happened yet, but had been planned. Planned because she'd found something she wasn't supposed to find and hadn't stopped documenting. Ava set the laptop on the desk. The phone at the reception desk rang. Desjardins' colleague answered it, listened, and turned. "The recovery unit is flagging an issue with Hollis," he said. "They're asking for the liaison." Desjardins moved immediately. Ava followed one step behind, instinct overriding the boundaries of her current status before she could stop it, and Desjardins didn't tell her not to. They moved down the corridor towards surgical recovery, and the flag turned out to be not a medical emergency, but something more complicated. A member of Hollis's own staff, a deputy chief of staff named Garrett, who had arrived in the last 10 minutes and was attempting to speak privately with Hollis, and was being prevented from doing so by Rutherford's personnel, and who was now making arguments about access rights and jurisdiction in the recovery bay doorway with the specific energy of a man who had a very particular reason for wanting to be in that room. Rutherford was on the phone 15 feet away, watching Garrett with an expression that was not quite readable. Desjardins went to Rutherford. They conferred for 40 seconds. Then Rutherford ended his call and looked at Ava. "Garrett," he said at a volume only she could hear. "He's flagged in the pre-existing inquiry. We weren't sure how he was connected. We are now." A pause. "He came here because he heard Hollis was alive. He came here to find out how much Hollis knows about what happened to that vehicle today." Ava looked at Garrett in the recovery bay doorway. A man in his mid-40s, expensive coat, the controlled desperation of someone performing calm very hard. "The incident," she said slowly. "The vehicle. You said it was classified." "The nature of it, yes. But it wasn't an accident." Rutherford looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it was not an accident." The recovery bay door opened from inside and a nurse said Hollis was asking to speak with someone from the investigation, and Garrett stepped forward and Rutherford's hand came up, not touching, just placed in the air between them, and said quietly, "Not you." Garrett's composure cracked. Not entirely, just at the seam. "Then who?" he asked. Rutherford turned and looked at Ava. And the look was a question and also already an answer. And in the recovery bay behind the nurse, she could see the pale shape of Warren Hollis in the bed, propped up, his eyes open and tracking, and those eyes found her through the doorway with the particular focus of a man who had been unconscious for hours and had woken up to a world that had moved and was trying to establish what was solid. He'd asked for someone from the investigation. Rutherford had pointed to her, and Garrett, standing between them, understood something in that moment that changed his face entirely. Because if Hollis was awake, and if Hollis was talking, then whatever Garrett had come here to prevent had already happened, or was about to. His hand went to his jacket pocket. Rutherford moved first. Not fast. He didn't need to be fast, because the two soldiers nearest Garrett had already shifted their positions in the half-second before anyone else in the corridor registered what was happening. And Garrett's hand came out of his jacket pocket holding a phone. Just a phone. But the soldiers didn't know that yet, and neither did Ava. And the 2 seconds between the hand going in and the hand coming out were the longest 2 seconds in that hallway. Nobody touched Garrett. Nobody needed to. The geometry of the corridor made the point without contact. 2 soldiers at angles, Rutherford between Garrett and the recovery bay door, and Garrett standing very still with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who had just understood, viscerally, that the situation had closed around him. "I'd like you to put that on the floor," Rutherford said. "It's a phone." "I can see that. Put it on the floor anyway." Garrett bent slowly and set it down. One of the soldiers picked it up. Desjardins was beside Rutherford now. She looked at the phone, looked at Garrett, and said to Rutherford at a register Ava could barely hear, "That's enough for a hold." Rutherford nodded once. What happened to Garrett after that was efficient and quiet. A federal hold was not an arrest, technically, but the practical experience of it was similar enough that Garrett's face went through several distinct phases in the space of about 30 seconds, ending somewhere between disbelief and the gray stillness of a man doing rapid damage assessment on his own situation. They walked him to the administrative conference room. The door closed. The recovery bay door was still open. The nurse was still standing in it. Rutherford looked at Ava. "Go," he said. Mom. Warren Hollis looked worse than she'd expected, and better than he had any right to, which was probably an accurate summary of his whole day. He was in the bed at a reclined angle, an IV line in his left arm, monitors at a steady rhythm. His color was returning, not fully, the grayish undertone of post-surgical blood loss still visible in the skin around his eyes, but his gaze was present and precise in the way she'd noticed before. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat, because standing over a patient in a hospital bed was a power dynamic she'd always found unnecessary. "You came back," he said. "You asked." "I didn't know if they'd let you." "They did." She looked at the monitors out of habit. Rhythm stable, pressure low normal, oxygen sitting at 94. Acceptable for the first hour post-surgery, would want to see it climb over the next few hours. "How's the pain?" "Managed." He meant it as a complete sentence, the way people did when they didn't want to spend time on pain. "The nurse told me what the surgery found. Splenic hilum bleed, it's sealed. You'll be here a few days minimum." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The person who tried to stop you from coming in just now." "Garrett. Marcus Garrett. He's been my deputy chief of staff for 14 months. His voice was flat in the way of someone speaking carefully around something that still hurt to look at directly. "Tell me what you know about him." She told him what Rutherford had told her, flagged in the pre-existing inquiry, connection unclear until today. She kept it factual and short. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she'd noticed in people who were used to receiving information in compressed form and processing it without performance. When she finished, he said, "The vehicle incident. I was told it wasn't an accident." It wasn't. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "We had a route deviation 40 minutes outside Silver Creek. The driver got a call rerouting us through a secondary road. Garrett arranged the schedule that morning. He's the only one besides my security chief who knew the original itinerary." He paused. "The security chief is the one who got me here." She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make it easier to have looked at someone across a desk for 14 months and now be doing this math. "The infrastructure grant," he said. "Yes. Northridge's parent network was positioned to receive a significant subcontract under the grant. That's not public. It was in the preliminary allocation documents. He turned his head to look at her directly. If the federal inquiry into the hospital's billing practices went public before the grant was finalized, the network would have been disqualified. Garrett had a financial relationship with the network's parent holding company that he hadn't disclosed. There it was. The full architecture, assembled from pieces she'd been holding separately. The billing fraud. The inquiry that was already open. Her removal, arranged to protect the cover. Garrett's connection to the hospital network. The vehicle incident, timed to prevent the one official with authority over the grant from surviving long enough to see the inquiry reach its conclusion. She'd been a loose thread. Hollis had been the whole garment. He nearly succeeded, Hollis said, on both counts. On one count, she said. He didn't succeed on mine. Hollis looked at her with something that took a moment to identify because it was simple, straightforward appreciation, unperformed, the kind that didn't reach for language. No, he said. He didn't. Go on. She left him to rest and went back into the corridor where Desjardins was waiting with the contained energy of someone who'd been receiving information while Ava had been in that room and was now holding more of it than she'd had before. Garrett's talking, Desjardins said, not with satisfaction, with the particular clinical neutrality of someone for whom talking suspects were instrumental rather than gratifying. Already? He had a lawyer on call. The lawyer apparently advised cooperation, which usually means the lawyer took one look at the evidence package and made a decision. She glanced toward the conference room. He's confirmed the financial relationship with the holding company. He hasn't addressed the vehicle incident yet, but he will. The trajectory is clear. What about Calloway? Calloway's attorney is present. He's not talking. She paused. He doesn't need to. The audit summary you retrieved. She stopped, recalibrated. The one you provided. In combination with the deletion of the telemetry record and the 3-month-old personnel notation, we have a documented pattern that doesn't require his testimony to establish. His cooperation would help the timeline. His silence helps the case. She said that last part without irony, and Ava absorbed it. The way institutional corruption documented over time didn't actually need the person at the center to confess, because they generated enough paperwork in the process of managing it to build the case themselves. Voss, Ava said. Desjardins' expression shifted slightly. Dr. Voss is a more complicated question. His complaint against you appears to have been solicited. Calloway's assistant has indicated in a preliminary statement that Calloway contacted Voss before the formal complaint was filed, not after. But Voss had his own reasons to want you off the unit, and those reasons may not connect to the larger fraud. That's a distinction that matters legally. She looked at Ava steadily. He may face professional consequences through the medical board rather than criminal ones. That's not resolution of the kind that... I understand how it works, Ava said. She did. She'd understood since the conference room this morning that not everything that was wrong would end in handcuffs, and that the difference between what was provable and what was true was a gap she'd have to live in for a while. Desjardins nodded. I want to update you on Priya Suresh. Ava had been waiting for that without knowing she was waiting for it. She gave a statement an hour ago, full account of observing the system record deletion. She identified the administrator who performed it. It was Calloway's executive assistant, operating on an instruction she says came directly from Calloway within 40 minutes of the Fitch incident. Desjardins paused. Priya also provided 3 additional documents she'd retained, printed records. She said she'd been keeping them for 2 months because something didn't feel right, and she didn't know what else to do with them. 2 months. Priya had been sitting on it for 2 months, alone, not knowing who to trust or what to do, showing up to her shifts and doing her job and carrying it. Ava thought about the small figure stepping out from the break room wall, pressing something into her hand, stepping back. Get some rest. The economy of someone who had already decided in the few seconds available to them exactly how much they could safely do and done exactly that much. Is she protected? Ava asked. She has whistleblower status as of 90 minutes ago. Yes. Ava let out a breath she hadn't been tracking. The afternoon moved forward in the way that days with too much in them moved, not slowly, but with a compressed quality, each hour denser than the last. Rutherford briefed her twice more, each time adding pieces to the picture, each time with the sense of a structure that had been built in her absence being revealed to her now that she was standing inside it. The Northridge parent network, Crestline Health Systems, had been under preliminary review for 7 months. The billing discrepancy she'd flagged in the oncology unit was one of dozens identified across 4 facilities in 3 states. The Silver Creek facility had been the cleanest on paper, which was why it had taken longer to reach, and which was why the oncology documentation gap had been significant. It had been a pressure point, a place where the system had been implemented carelessly because someone had assumed a step-down unit nurse wasn't the kind of person who would notice and then document it in a composition notebook. They had assumed wrong. At 5:40 in the afternoon, Calloway was formally escorted from the building. Ava was in the corridor near the nursing station when it happened, and she saw it the way she'd been seen that morning. From the vantage point of a hallway, watching someone make the walk she'd made, except that Calloway made it with a federal agent on each side and his attorney on the phone and his jacket in the same perfect order it had been in all day, because some people held their presentation together even when everything underneath it was dissolving. He didn't look at her when he passed. She didn't need him to. Price followed 20 minutes later with her own attorney and a quieter expression, not collapsed, but the expression of someone who had been cooperating and knew the difference between what that meant for her and what not cooperating had meant for Calloway, and was holding on to that distinction. Voss was not escorted out. Voss was served with a formal notification of medical board inquiry and allowed to leave on his own, which he did, and she caught a glimpse of him near the elevator. His coat on, his jaw set in a direction that had collapsed slightly from its morning orientation, the chart in his hand for once, not something he knew what to do with. He saw her. He stopped. She looked at him for a second and then looked away, not because she was conceding anything, but because there was nothing in his face she needed to read anymore. At 6:15, Rutherford found her in the family waiting area where she'd spent part of the afternoon, still in her scrubs, with a cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He sat down across from her, which was not something she'd seen him do yet. Take a chair, settle into it, operate at the register of a conversation rather than a briefing. Hollis wants to make a formal public statement tomorrow, he said, once he's cleared for it medically. He's asked that you be present. I don't need to be present. He's aware of that. He looked at her. He wants you there anyway. She wrapped both hands around the cold coffee cup. What does the public statement cover? His account of what occurred, the investigation, your role. He paused. He's going to identify you by name. He's going to describe what you did, both today and in terms of the oncology documentation. She sat with that for a moment. The thing she'd spent 2 years building, the quiet life, the unremarkable existence, the careful distance from anything that would require her to be known for what she actually was going to be over tomorrow in a way she couldn't manage or contain. It's going to come out either way, Rutherford said, not without gentleness. I know. There are things that come with it that you may not have considered. He said it carefully. Your service record, the Kandahar AAR, the commendation that was attached to it. He stopped. She looked at him. What commendation? He held her gaze. The one that was processed in your final year of service and apparently never formally communicated to you. Something in his expression. Not quite anger, but the disciplined equivalent of it. That's a separate matter, and there will be an answer for how that happened. But it exists, and it will be part of what's in front of people tomorrow. She didn't say anything. There were several things she could have said, and none of them were adequate to the specific weight of being told that something you'd earned had existed without your knowledge, had sat in a file somewhere while you'd moved to a city where nobody knew your name and taken a job where you could be unremarkable. She set the coffee cup down on the side table. There's one more thing, Rutherford said. He reached into his jacket and took out a folded document. Not a tablet this time, actual paper, the kind that meant someone had printed it because paper felt more final. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it without picking it up. It was a letterhead she recognized, and her name at the top. Read it when you're ready, he said. There's no deadline tonight. He stood. We're holding a formal briefing at 9 tomorrow morning before Hollis's statement. I'd like you there for that as well. She nodded. He left her with the document on the table between her and the cold coffee, and the waiting room was quiet except for the muted television, which had moved to the evening news cycle, and the banner, scrolling across the bottom, was no longer about a federal inquiry in general terms. It was specific now. It named Crestline Health Systems. It named North Ridge Medical Center. It named Paul Calloway. It named a federal investigation into billing fraud, patient safety violations, and what the banner called obstruction of a federal oversight inquiry. And then, in the next scroll, a line she hadn't expected. Sources indicate a clinical whistleblower was targeted and removed prior to federal intervention. Identity not yet confirmed. Not yet confirmed. She picked up the folded document. She opened it. It was not what she thought it was. She'd assumed it was the commendation Rutherford had mentioned, or a formal reinstatement notice, or something procedural. It was a letter, handwritten on the letterhead, which meant someone had made a deliberate choice about format. The handwriting was careful and slightly effortful. The handwriting of someone doing it by hand because the content warranted it and not because the hand found it easy. It was from Warren Hollis. Written, based on the timestamp, from his recovery bay at 4:40 this afternoon, which meant he'd asked for paper and a pen while he was still coming out from anesthesia, which was either the most determined thing she'd heard all day or a close second. She read it. When she finished, she folded it back the way it had come and sat with it in her lap and looked at the television. The banner had moved on to other news. Silver Creek's evening continued outside the windows, the city going about itself, not knowing most of what had happened inside this building today, not knowing yet who she was or what any of it meant. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. But this one was local, Silver Creek area code. She answered. Ava Mitchell? A man's voice. Not military, not federal. The cadence of a journalist clipped and practiced at introducing itself in a way designed to prevent immediate hang-up. I'm calling from the Silver Creek Courier. We've been following the federal activity at North Ridge today, and we have your name connected to the whistleblower report. I'd like to give you a chance to comment before we run the story. She was quiet for 1 second. When are you running it? She asked. Tonight, 11 o'clock edition. A pause. We have most of it already. The fraud investigation, the termination, your military background. Another pause, more deliberate. We also have a source who's given us something that wasn't in the federal briefing, something about the Kandahar mission specifically. His voice took on the careful weight of someone holding a card. I think you'll want to talk to us before this runs. She looked at the document in her lap, at Hollis's handwriting, at the television. Who's your source? She said. The journalist paused one beat too long. I'm not able to. Let me ask you something else then. She kept her voice level. Does your source have a name that starts with G? The pause this time was different, smaller, sharper, the pause of someone recalibrating. Ms. Mitchell, Garrett's in federal custody, she said. Whatever he gave you, you should verify it before you run it, because if it came from him, there's a reason he wanted it out tonight. She ended the call. She sat very still. Garrett had made a call before they took his phone, or he'd made it after. One call, attorney permitted, the kind you were allowed, and he'd used it not to protect himself but to push something out into the world that he thought would change the shape of tomorrow morning before Hollis could speak. The Kandahar mission, specifically. She didn't know what he had. She didn't know what version of it existed in whatever file he'd accessed, or been given access to, or purchased access to. She knew what had actually happened on that hillside. She knew what was in the after-action report. She knew there were two ways to read what she'd done that day, and one of them was what Rutherford knew about, and one of them was not. The journalist would run something. Tonight, before the briefing, before Hollis's statement, before any of the morning's architecture could be put in place. She picked up her phone again and called Rutherford. He answered on the second ring. We have a problem, she said. Rutherford didn't waste time on reaction. What's the name of the journalist? He asked. She gave it. She gave the paper name. She told him what the man had said about the source, about Kandahar, about the 11 o'clock deadline. And Rutherford listened to all of it in the way he listened to everything, without interruption, processing in real time, already building the response before she finished speaking. All right, he said, stay where you are. He was in the waiting room 8 minutes later, which told her he'd been closer than she'd assumed, or he'd moved fast, or both. He had one of his officers with him and a phone in his hand that he'd been on during the walk over. Garrett's attorney confirmed he made one call before the phone was taken, Rutherford said. The number connects to a communications consultant who has a prior working relationship with the courier. Garrett spent the last 3 months with access to the Deputy Secretary's briefing documents, which included a summary of a 2018 classified mission review. He sat down. He pulled something from that summary and shaped it. That's what your journalist has. Shaped it how? Rutherford looked at her. He had the expression of someone who was about to say something that required the other person to hold still for it. The AAR from Kandahar has 2 versions in the system. The original, filed by your CO, and an amended version filed 6 weeks later by a different officer. The amended version reframes a field decision you made as a protocol deviation rather than a tactical judgment call. He paused. The original version was what Hollis's liaison used to find you today. The amended version is what Garrett pulled. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't quite surprise, because some part of her had always known something like this existed. Some explanation for the way certain things had gone in the final period of her service, the way opportunities had quietly closed, the way the commendation Rutherford had mentioned had apparently been processed and then gone nowhere. Who filed the amendment? She asked. A Major Harkins. He's been out of service for 4 years. We're locating him. She sat with the weight of that name, a name she knew, a face she could still place, a man she'd understood at the time to be someone who operated by a particular code of institutional loyalty that sometimes aligned with actual right and wrong, and sometimes didn't. The field decision, she said. He's going to frame it as reckless. That appears to be the shape of what Garrett passed to the journalist, yes. She thought about that hillside. She thought about the 3 soldiers on the ground and the 40-second window she'd had to make a call that was going to be wrong in one direction or another, wrong in a way that cost a life, or wrong in a way that violated a protocol that existed for good reasons in most situations and catastrophic ones in that specific moment. She had made the call. She stood behind it. But she also knew that standing behind a decision and being able to win a public argument about it at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in Silver Creek were 2 different things. What are our options? She asked. Rutherford leaned forward. The original AAR is declassified enough for limited disclosure. I can authorize a release to a federal press liaison who contacts the courier directly and puts the amended version in context. He looked at her. That's the institutional path. It takes time we don't have tonight. And the other path. You talked to the journalist yourself, on the record, before 10 o'clock. She looked at the window. Outside it was full dark now, Silver Creek lit in the ordinary way of a mid-sized city on an ordinary Tuesday evening, unaware. If I talk to him, she said, I lose control of how the story goes from there. You've already lost that control. The question is whether the first version that reaches people is his or yours. She thought about 2 years of choosing to be invisible. She thought about the parking lot this morning, and Calloway's expression in the conference room, and Voss's voice in the hallway carrying the way he hadn't bothered to lower it. She thought about every assumption that had been made about what kind of person she was and what she was capable of, made by people who had not looked carefully enough because looking carefully hadn't been necessary. She'd been the kind of person you didn't need to look at carefully. She thought about Priya, who had printed documents and kept them for 2 months, and waited for the right moment with a patience that had required more courage than most visible acts of bravery. Set up the call, she said. She spoke to the journalist for 31 minutes in a side office off the lobby with Rutherford's press liaison present and a recorder running. She was not a natural interviewee. She spoke in the compressed, precise sentences of someone who had been trained to report situations rather than narrate them. And the journalist had to work to get anything that sounded like emotion, which she gave him in the places where it was true and withheld it in the places where it wasn't. She told him about the care conference, about the telemetry record, about being walked through the lobby with her badge gone while the staff looked away. She told him about the parking lot and the helicopters and what she'd recognized in the landing pattern, and she told him about Hollis and the specific injury and the surgical decision and what it had required. She did not make it heroic. She made it accurate, which was harder. When he asked about Kandahar, she said, "I made a field call under time pressure with incomplete information and 3 soldiers on the ground. One of them is alive. The decision I made is the reason he's alive. I'll answer for that call to anyone who was there and let the record speak to everyone else." He pushed. She held. He asked about the amended AAR, and she said she hadn't seen it, which was true, and that its existence was a matter now under investigation by the same federal inquiry covering the hospital, which was also true, and that she'd leave its contents to people qualified to assess it in full context. When the call ended, the liaison looked at her and said, "That was well handled. I just told him what happened." "That's what I mean." The story ran at 11. She read it on her phone in the waiting room, having decided she wasn't going to go home tonight until she'd read what it said. It was not the story Garrett had wanted. The journalist had done his job, which meant he'd verified, and the verification had produced a story that was substantially about the fraud investigation and Hollis and the termination, and substantially less about Kandahar, which appeared in 3 paragraphs near the bottom, framed carefully, including her quote. It was not a perfect story. It had errors of emphasis and one factual imprecision about the timeline she'd have to address later. But it was not a weapon. Garrett had spent his one phone call building something that had not worked, and that failure was its own kind of conclusion. She slept in her apartment for 5 hours. Not enough, but her body took what it could get and stopped when it stopped. She was at North Ridge by 7:30 in the morning, which was earlier than the 9 o'clock briefing required, and she wasn't entirely sure why until she found herself at the elevator bank pressing 3. The ICU was quieter in the early morning. Torres was at the desk again and nodded at her. A different nod than yesterday's, a nod that had information in it about how the last 18 hours had changed the building's understanding of who she was, which she accepted without comment. Dolores Fitch was awake. She was sitting up with a cup of tea that had come from somewhere that wasn't a hospital vending machine, which told Ava someone had brought it from outside, which told her Fitch had people. "I read the story," Fitch said, when Ava pulled up the chair. "I figured you would. You didn't say much about me. Your case is part of an open investigation. I'm not going to discuss a patient's medical situation with a journalist." Fitch looked at her over the cup. "You could have. It would have made the story better." "Probably. But you didn't." She set the cup down. "Why?" Ava thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because it wasn't mine to use," she said finally. "What happened to you, not to me." Fitch was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm between them. "My daughter called last night," Fitch said. "She saw the news report. She's flying in from Denver this afternoon." A pause. "I hadn't told her I was here. Didn't want her to worry. She's going to be annoyed about that." "Furious," Fitch agreed, and her mouth curved. "She gets that from her father. I get to tell her she was right about everything, and she'll only be satisfied about it for about 20 minutes before she starts worrying about the next thing." She looked at Ava. "You have people like that?" Ava thought about it honestly. "Not close by," she said. "Not anymore." "You should," Fitch said. It wasn't advice exactly. It was the observation of a woman who'd spent 2 days in a hospital bed thinking about the shapes of her life. Someone should know where you are. Ava sat with that for a moment. It landed in a way she didn't have an answer for, which meant it was probably accurate. She squeezed Fitch's hand once, brief, not theatrical, and left her to the tea and the monitor and the arriving daughter. The 9 o'clock briefing was in the main conference room, the same one with the glass walls. And the glass walls this morning showed a lobby that had reconfigured itself again. There were federal personnel who hadn't been there yesterday, and there were hospital staff moving with the particular uncertainty of people whose institutional structure had abruptly changed shape and who were feeling their way through the new one. The briefing was Rutherford and Desjardins and Varga by phone and 2 people from the OIG that Ava hadn't met. It lasted 40 minutes and covered the investigative status, the criminal referrals that were being prepared, and the immediate administrative changes at North Ridge, which included the appointment of an interim director from the hospital network's oversight board, someone brought in from outside, which was the only arrangement Desjardins would accept. Calloway had been formally charged. The charges were fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The last charge, because the deletion of the telemetry record, done at his direction, met the legal threshold. His attorney had indicated he would fight, which Desjardins received with the equanimity of someone who had a file 3 inches thick and was not concerned. Price had accepted a cooperation agreement. She would not face criminal charges. She would face professional consequences through the state licensing board, which were significant and appropriate. Voss had received formal notification of a medical board hearing. The board's preliminary assessment, based on the clinical record review, was that his conduct in the Fitch case and his formal complaint against Ava constituted a reportable pattern. His hospital privileges at North Ridge were suspended pending the hearing. And then Rutherford said, "There's one more item." He looked at Ava across the conference table. "The commendation I referenced last night. I want to address it formally in this room." He held her gaze. In the fall of 2019, following review of the Kandahar After Action Report, the original, not the amended version, a commendation for valor under fire was approved for then Staff Sergeant Ava Mitchell. The commendation was processed through the Personnel Office and apparently stalled in the administrative transition following her separation from service. It was never formally communicated to her. He paused. The amended AAR was filed 6 weeks after the original. We believe it was filed in an attempt to retroactively undermine the basis for the commendation. It didn't succeed in blocking the commendation because the commendation had already been approved. It succeeded only in ensuring that the approval was never acted on. The room was quiet. "Major Harkins was located this morning," Rutherford said. "He's given a statement. The amendment was filed at the direction of a superior officer who had a dispute with Staff Sergeant Mitchell's commanding officer dating from a separate incident. She was, in the language Harkins used, caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with her." He folded his hands. "The commendation will be formally presented at a ceremony to be scheduled at the earliest appropriate date. The amended AAR will be removed from the record and replaced with the original." Ava sat at the conference table in her scrubs. She'd come back in her scrubs because she hadn't been home long enough to change and didn't own anything more formal anyway. And she absorbed this in the way she absorbed things that required a moment, by holding very still and letting it settle before she responded to it. She had not done what she'd done in that parking lot, or in Bay 3, or in the 31-minute phone call last night for a commendation. She'd done it because Hollis was dying and she knew why, and because 2 years of trying to be someone who didn't act on what she knew had not actually produced someone who didn't act on what she knew. It had produced someone who had been quiet about it until quiet wasn't an option. But the commendation existed. It had existed, unseen, while she'd been invisible by choice. And hearing it named aloud in this room, formally, in front of witnesses, did something to a space inside her that had been held tight for a long time. She said, "Thank you." It was not adequate to what she felt. She said it anyway because it was what she had. The public statement happened at noon in the hospital's main conference space, which had been reconfigured with chairs and a podium and a cluster of press that had grown significantly overnight as the federal story spread. Hollis was not there in person. He was still in the ICU, not yet cleared for transport or extended activity, but he'd recorded a video statement on a tablet from his bed, and Rutherford played it on the screen at the front of the room, and the room watched in the quiet that descends when a man who was nearly dead yesterday is speaking in sentences. Hollis was direct, as she'd expected. He described the vehicle incident without detail, ongoing investigation, classified components, what could be said and what couldn't. He described his arrival at North Ridge and his condition and the medical situation and what had happened in Bay 3. He named Ava Mitchell. He described what she'd done and what the surgical team had found and what the prognosis was. He said, "She identified what I had in approximately 90 seconds. The team with full imaging and monitoring available had not identified it in over an hour." He said, "She was standing in the parking lot because this hospital fired her 4 hours earlier. I want people to understand what that sentence means." He said, "This investigation is not about one nurse in one hospital. It is about a system that was structured to make inconvenient people disappear quietly. She didn't disappear. That failure of their plan is the reason I'm alive." When the video ended, Rutherford addressed the press for 15 minutes. Desjardins spoke briefly about the investigative scope. Varga's office issued a written statement that was distributed at the door, and then someone in the press pool raised a hand and asked if Nurse Mitchell was present. She was sitting in the second row, which was as close to the front as she'd been willing to go. She stood. The questions came in the compressed, overlapping way of press questions when there was real story available, and she answered them the way she'd answered the journalist the night before. Precisely, without performance, correcting imprecisions when she encountered them, declining to speculate where speculation would be inaccurate. Someone asked how she'd felt being walked out of the building the morning before. She thought about it. She said, "I was angry. Not in a way that consumed me, just I knew what I'd done and I knew what they said I'd done. And those two things were far enough apart that it was clarifying." Someone asked what she was going to do now. She said she didn't know yet. It was honest. Someone asked if she was going to return to nursing. She said, "That's always been the job. I haven't changed." Binhut. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference room, Priya found her. Priya looked like someone who had also not slept much, which was accurate, and who had walked through 24 hours that had fundamentally altered her relationship to the institution she'd been working inside for 3 years, which was also accurate. She was small and composed in the way of someone who had decided how to inhabit herself and was inhabiting it. "I heard about the statement," Priya said. "Hollis's. I haven't watched the recording yet. He said your name a lot. I heard it was thorough." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, "I kept those documents for 2 months. I want you to know that it wasn't bravery. I was scared the whole time. I just didn't know who to give them to." "You gave them to me," Ava said. "That was the right call. I could have given them to you 6 weeks earlier." "You didn't know me 6 weeks earlier. Not well enough for that kind of trust." Ava looked at her. The timing was what it was. The documents existed. That's what mattered. Priya absorbed that. She nodded slowly, not because she was entirely convinced, but because she was willing to let herself be partially released from the weight of the timing. "Are you staying?" Priya asked. "At North Ridge." "That's a complicated question right now. The interim director wants to meet with you. I heard it from Torres." "I know." The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. She'd been told it would include a formal offer of reinstatement, full back pay for the period of wrongful termination, and a restoration of her personnel file, the removal of the manufactured notation, and the correction of the record. She'd been told all of that through Desjardins, procedurally, and she had not yet decided what answer she was going to give. 2 years ago, she'd chosen Silver Creek because it was far from everything. She'd chosen quiet because loud had cost her things she wasn't ready to examine. She'd built a life scaled to what she thought she could manage, and she'd done it well enough that for a while she'd almost believed it was the life she'd wanted. The trouble was that yesterday had happened, and she'd moved through it with a fluency that the quiet life had not produced and could not have produced. The fluency came from the other thing, the thing she'd tried to keep separate, and the separation had never been real. It had been administrative. A line she'd drawn that the person she actually was had kept stepping over without noticing. She was a nurse. She was also a soldier, former, and the two things weren't opposites. They were the same orientation expressed in different contexts. You moved toward the problem, you assessed it, you made the best call available with the information you had, and you held it. She didn't know yet what the next version of that looked like in practical terms. She knew it wasn't invisibility. The last 2 days had made that clear in a way that 2 years of choosing it hadn't. At 2 o'clock, she met with the interim director, a woman named Pauline Reyes, who had the brisk competence of someone parachuted into a crisis and capable of operating in it. Reyes offered the reinstatement. She offered the back pay. She offered a formal written apology from the institution, which was a thing hospitals almost never offered voluntarily, and which Reyes apparently understood was necessary if North Ridge was going to rebuild any functional credibility. Ava accepted the reinstatement and the back pay. On the apology, she said, "Make it specific, not, 'we regret the circumstances.' Name what happened." Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote it down. "Specific," she said. "Yes." They worked out the practical terms. Ava would return to the cardiac step-down unit on a modified schedule while the full clinical review was completed. She would be involved in the quality review process for the oncology billing discrepancies as a clinical consultant. She would not report to Harlow. Harlow had retained her position, had given her statement, was in the process of whatever internal reckoning that required, but the direct reporting relationship was not going to be functional, and both of them knew it. One more thing, Reyes said. She had a document on the desk between them that Ava hadn't seen yet. Colonel Rutherford's office submitted a formal request this morning, unrelated to your employment here. She slid the document across. You are not obligated to consider it, but he asked that it reach you. Ava looked at it. It was a program description, a Department of Defense initiative, relatively new, designed to place veterans with medical backgrounds into civilian healthcare consulting roles focused on trauma and emergency protocol development. The program was voluntary, civilian compensated, and structured around a 6-month engagement that could be extended. Her name was in the top right corner, handwritten, in what she'd come to recognize as Rutherford's handwriting. She thought about what Fitch had said that morning. Someone should know where you are. Not in the literal sense, in the sense of purpose, of being locatable, of not having arranged your life around being too small to find. She put the document in her bag. She thanked Reyes and stood and walked back through the hospital, through the corridor, past the nursing stations where people she'd worked beside for 2 years looked at her now with an attention that was different from yesterday's, not uniformly comfortable but honest in its discomfort, which was something she could work with. She stopped at the nursing station on the step-down unit. The aide at the desk was young, someone she'd seen but not worked with directly, who looked up with the uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure of the protocol for this moment. Is Mrs. Fitch's chart still accessible from here? Ava asked. Yes, she's still in ICU. Can you flag it for a follow-up consult? I want to review her rhythm trend from the last 12 hours. The aide typed it in. Done. Simple. That's simple. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Silver Creek was visible in the afternoon light. Flat in the middle, hilly to the east, a city that had not known her name yesterday morning and knew it today and would know it differently again tomorrow as the investigation continued and the story developed and the full shape of what had been happening inside this building came into public view. She had not asked for any of it. She had not performed for any of it. She had looked at a telemetry strip and said what she saw, and then she had said it again, and then she had been removed, and then she had kept moving because stopping was the one thing she genuinely did not know how to do. That was the truth of it, underneath everything, not heroism, not strategy. Just a person who had been trained in contexts that made stopping unthinkable, who had brought that single fact with her into a civilian life and found that it was both the quality that made her difficult to work with inside a compromised institution and the quality that made her impossible to actually stop. They had counted on her stopping. The badge removed, the escort through the lobby, the theater of public disgrace, all of it designed to produce a person who would go home and stay there and not be a problem anymore. And she had gone to the parking lot, and she had sat in the car, and she had looked at the note Priya had pressed into her hand. She had not stopped. That was not a small thing. She understood that now more clearly than she had the day before, not because someone had told her it was significant, but because she'd watched what stopping would have meant, watched it in the shape of what Hollis had nearly become, in the shape of 47 patients whose records existed in a billing system no one had been meant to examine closely, in the shape of the 11-day gap in the oncology log that she'd noticed because she noticed things and written down because she wrote things down. The people who had built the system that wanted her gone had understood that about her before she'd fully understood it about herself. They'd known she was dangerous to them before she'd known why. That was its own kind of recognition. Not the kind she'd wanted, not the kind she'd have chosen, but real, and it told her something about the value of the thing they'd tried so hard to take from her. In her bag, against her hip, was Rutherford's document and Hollis's letter. In her jacket pocket was the empty space where Priya's USB drive had been, passed to Desjardins in a chain of custody that was now part of a federal case file. In the ICU upstairs was a woman whose heart had kept its rhythm through the night. None of it was clean. The investigation would take months. Voss's hearing would be contested and complicated. Harkins's explanation would need to be fully reviewed before anything about the original AAR was formally resolved, and she would return to work tomorrow in a building that was still processing what had happened, working alongside people who had looked away and were now living with having looked away. And that was not a simple thing to navigate, and she wouldn't pretend it was. But she would be there, badged, documented, reinstated, and known, not invisible, not quiet in the particular way that had become a kind of hiding. Known. Outside the window, a cloud shifted and the afternoon light changed on the city. The way light in March changed fast and without warning, sudden brightness after a long gray spell. She watched it move across the rooftops and the hills. Then she turned away from the window and walked back toward the nursing station, because there was a chart to review and a patient to check on, and that was the job, and she had always known how to do it.